Hi, and welcome to this presentation on getting started with Linux for the SQL Server DBA. My name is Edwin Sarmiento. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master for SQL Server, and my key area of expertise is on high availability and disaster recovery. Now, I used to be an Oracle DBA and ran Oracle databases on top of a Linux, a Unix, or even a Solaris system. So I figured, why not try out running SQL Server on top of a Linux system now that Microsoft fully supports it? If you have any questions regarding this presentation, feel free to get in touch with me either through email, through social media, be it through Twitter or LinkedIn, or you can visit my blog or mssqltips.com if you want to learn more about how to run SQL Server always on availability groups on top of a Linux server operating system. Now, if I was a sales guy trying to sell you the idea of Microsoft fully supporting SQL Server on top of a Linux system, I could talk about all of the benefits, the features of running SQL Server on Linux. I mean, I could tell you all about multi platform. It used to be the case when Microsoft would only run SQL Server just on Windows. For decades, it was built for Windows. It was built by Microsoft. So you know that it is specifically for Windows. With SQL Server 2017, Microsoft changed that. You can now run SQL Server on top of Windows and Linux as well. I could also talk about increased performance, although Microsoft will not really talk about the fact that running SQL Server on Linux is a bit faster than it is running it on top of a Windows system. But I'll let them talk about it themselves. I could also talk about reduced total cost of ownership. I mean, when you think about it, building high performance SQL Server database systems on top of a Windows platform, you would need those expensive hardware. But with Linux, you could use commodity hardware, thus lowering your total cost of ownership for hardware acquisition. I could also talk about highly available systems. With SQL Server on Linux, you could provide high availability to your SQL Server databases. Well, of course, that's if I was a sales guy. I'm not a sales guy, not a marketing guy. I am a SQL Server professional. I used to work as an operations DBA. A couple of years ago, I worked for a remote DBA services company. The idea being is that clients and customers would come to us and we will manage and take care of their databases. But guess what? Our key competency as a company is not quite what you think it is. Guess what our key competency is? It's that other database platform. Yes, there is no second guessing. The company was founded by Oracle DBAs. They were founders, they were Oracle experts. And so they started a company providing remote DBA services to customers running Oracle databases. Now, every day, whenever I'm going to work and I'm sitting in my cubicle, I'm surrounded by people who are hardcore Unix and Linux experts. Systems engineers, administrators, even developers are working and creating application on the Linux platform. Now think about that for a second. Here I am, a SQL Server DBA, working primarily on Windows systems, surrounded by systems administrators, network engineers whose main platform that they've been working with day in and day out is Linux. Imagine how my day looks like. Well, here I am again sitting in my desk, typing commands and T-SQL statements on my SQL Server Management Studio. And here I hear from like a few feet away from where I'm sitting comments such as this. Hey, those Windows guys, can't they use a real operating system? Of course, I hear that on the background. And then another guy would just walk past and make Comments such as this. Huh, let me see you manage SQL Server without the GUI. And again, I'm working, I'm concentrating on what I'm trying to accomplish. And you're hearing comments such as this. And out of nowhere, another guy from the other end of the room would shout something like this. I bet you're doing right clicking exercises daily. How does that make you feel? If you were me and hear those comments every day as I go into the office, as I try to do my work, you hear people downplaying and even trying to prove that Linux guys are way better than the Windows folks, regardless of the database systems that you're working with. How did that make me feel? Well, yeah, exactly. This is exactly how I felt working in that environment. Now, though, for the record, like I said earlier, I'm an Oracle DBA. I don't hate Oracle. I was an Oracle DBA. I know how it works. I know I can manage it, and I don't hate Unix either, because most of the Oracle's databases that I've been working with run on either Unix or Linux. It's not that I hate the Linux in Oracle. It's just that, being that kind of environment, I kind of wish that at least Microsoft would come up with SQL Server that would run on top of a Linux system. Of course, back in the days, I used to think that's just wishful thinking. Why is that? Well, even up to 2015, the idea of running SQL Server on a Linux system is simply a topic for an April Fool's joke. I mean, think about it. People from the SQL Server community, whether they're MVPs, Microsoft Certified Masters, anybody from the SQL Server community would write an article or a blog post about SQL Server running on Linux, and guess what? It's an April Fool's joke. Of course, things have changed. I'm doing this presentation right now talking about SQL Server running on top of Linux. It's no longer an April Fool's joke. This time, until it was 2017 when Microsoft officially announced that SQL Server will be officially supported to run on top of Linux. This one is legit. When you see a web page like this on Microsoft.com that says SQL Server can now run on top of not just Windows, but Linux and Docker containers, you know they're serious. It's no longer a topic for an April Fool's joke. But it's quite surprising that Microsoft announced this on April 1st back in 2017. So a lot of people still thought, well, it's kind of a joke, but in this case, no, it's not. It is officially supported. This gives me an opportunity to prove those Linux guys, hey, we can do things that you guys can do. And this is what this whole presentation is all about. So I'm going to show you how you can get started with Linux. Now that Microsoft fully supports running SQL Server on Linux, I'm going to show you how to navigate your way around a Linux operating system with just a basic task that you can work with. Now, I'm currently logged into my Windows workstation, and as a Windows guy, you might be wondering, how do I get started managing a Linux operating system? I'm going to introduce you to two of the most common tools that every Linux administrator uses to manage a Linux machine. The first one is PuTTY. Now, PuTTY is an SSH client, or a secure shell client. A secure shell client is used to connect to a Linux machine and manage everything using the command line. Think of this as a secure remote command line access to a Linux machine. Now, because majority of the tasks that you're going to be performing on the Linux system will be done using the command line, you have to be very, very comfortable with the command line. You can download PuTTY from putty.org. You can download the executable. You don't even have to install it. Download it on your machine and simply run it. The other tool that I would like to introduce you to is WinSCP. Think of this as a graphical user interface that you could use to send or receive files, a file transfer utility that you can use for Linux. And because it's a graphical user interface, similar to Windows Explorer, you can use your mouse, you can drag and drop files from Windows to Linux and vice versa. Let's connect to our Linux machine using both WinSCP and PuTTY. I'm going to use the root user for WinSCP. Again, it's not recommended as a security best practice, but I'm going to demonstrate later on why I'm using this. And for PuTTY, I'm going to use a different account. Notice that this is similar to Windows Explorer. On the right pane is your Linux file system, and on your left pane is your Windows file system. We're going to leave this as is because we're going to be using PuTTY or the command line to perform most of our administrative tasks. Now, Linux is a file-based system. What that means is all of the configuration settings, everything in Linux is represented using files. When you want to configure something, you're going to configure it and store the configuration using files in the file system, which is totally unlike Windows that uses the Windows registry. So let's connect to our remote Linux system using PuTTY. This time, instead of me using the root user, I'm going to use the user account that was given to me by the Linux administrator. In Linux, everything that you would do as an administrator requires permission. You would have to ask for permission. Regardless of whether or not you have administrative privileges, you still have to ask for permission. Unlike in Windows, if you're already a member of the local administrators group, you can do whatever you want. Of course, unless the user access control is enabled. And I'm going to show you that later. The first thing that I usually do when I log into a Linux machine is to check the TCP IP configuration. The reason for that is I want to make sure that there are no firewall rules that are blocking access to the remote machine, or even client applications like SQL Server Management Studio can connect to my SQL Server database running on the Linux machine. Similar to accessing Windows IP configuration or TCP IP configuration, in Windows, I could use ipconfig. Or I can simply use the graphical user interface for Network and Sharing Center and look at the TCP IP configuration of the Windows machine. There is an equivalent command on Linux, IP address show. This shows me the TCP IP configuration or the IP address configuration of this machine. It's using two IP addresses. The first one is the loopback address, and the second one, which is the one that I'm using to connect to it, is the public IP address of 10.10.10.201. As I mentioned earlier, all of this information is stored in the file system. So the first thing that I do is to configure a file that stores the TCP IP configuration on this machine. That file is stored in a specific path, and we're going to use cd or change directory, the cd command, to navigate to that folder. Inside the etc/sysconfig/network-scripts is a list of files that I could use to configure networking configuration for this machine. We could use the ls command or the list command to list all of the files and folders inside this folder. I'm interested in a file called ifcfg-eth0 to configure the network adapter or the TCP/IP settings for this specific network adapter. I can use the cat command or the concatenate command to display the contents of this file. Oops, permission denied. Didn't I mention earlier that even though I am an administrator or I have administrative privileges on a Linux machine, I still need to ask for permission. To do that, I will need to run the sudo command to elevate my permissions so that I can go ahead and do whatever it is that I need to do. It's going to prompt me for my password. And after that, it's going to display the contents of this file, ifcfg-eth0. It tells me the IP address, subnet mask, the name of this device, the DNS server that I'm using to resolve the names of the machines in my network, and whether or not the zone is public or private. By the way, this file is empty when the Linux operating system got installed. In order for me to configure it, I have to enter all of this information inside this particular file. You can also look at this file from within WinSCP. EC, sysconfig, network scripts, and this exact file. Of course, you can modify this file from inside Windows using Notepad and then just copy it back to your Linux file system. Of course, the more familiar tool is SQL Server Management Studio, where we already know how to use SQL Server Management Studio to manage our SQL Server instance and SQL Server databases. Now, because the Linux machine is not joined or is not configured for Active Directory authentication, I can simply use SQL Server authentication for it. I'm going to connect using the SA login. Again, not a security best practice, but it's the only thing that's in here at the moment. Fresh install. I'll have to create another account inside my SQL Server instance. And I can simply use SQL Server Management Studio the way I've used it in the past. Let's say we want to take a look at the properties of this instance. We can see that it is running SQL Server Enterprise, core-based, CentOS Linux, the version, and so on and so forth. I can even look at the database settings and look at the database default locations. Notice that this is the way that the Linux file system is displayed and not traditional Windows file system with drive letters, files and folders, backslashes. These are all forward slashes. But there is no such thing as SQL Server Configuration Manager for Linux. Therefore, we can't use a graphical user interface to configure some of those settings that we're used to configuring using SQL Server Configuration Manager. However, Microsoft provided us with MS SQL-Conf. This is the fold, or rather the utility that you will use to configure SQL Server. For instance, SQL Server Agent is not configured just yet. So we can go ahead and configure SQL Server Agent using MS SQL-Conf. But before we look at that, first let's look at the file system and how SQL Server is stored inside the Linux file system. We can use CD to go to the top level folder and path for this. And we could look at the files where SQL Server is stored. You could either use PuTTY, inside opt, MS SQL, Bin is where your utilities are. You have MS SQL Conf. Remember that your database files are inside the var, opt, MS SQL. You have data, and you would see that you've got your system database files, your MDF and LDF files. Again, I'm showing you using WinSCP, or you can also navigate to that folder using PuTTY. Just going to use clear to clear up the screen and navigate to var, op, MS SQL, data. You might be wondering, why don't I have permission? I am a local administrator, or I have local administrator privileges. Again, that's because of the fact that I would need to ask for permission. When you're navigating to different parts of the Linux operating system, there are certain files and folders that you don't have permission to. So you would have to either request for permission from your administrator or be granted those permissions yourselves. By default, when SQL Server is installed on Linux, it creates the MS SQL user. So we're going to be using the MS SQL user to perform some of these tasks. For instance, if you look at database settings, let's say you don't want your data and log files to be in this particular folder. You can create a new folder for the database data and log files. How do we do that? First, let's create a folder inside the Linux file system. Let's say we'll use mkdir, which is the command for creating a directory. Let's create a tmp folder and a data folder inside that. And what we are going to do is we are going to assign a user access to this folder, kind of like granting your SQL Server service account permission to the folder. That way, it could create the database files inside this folder. We are going to use the chown command for change owner. I'm going to assign the MSSQL user to the tmp/data folder. On top of changing the owner, we're also going to use the chgrp to change the group. And once this is done, I can now use the MS SQL Conf to configure the database files to be stored on this particular folder. Using the MS SQL Conf utility, we're going to use the set command and define the file location dot default data. And we're going to pass the new path and folder for that file, rather folder that we just created. Similar to when you're configuring the default data and log file location for SQL Server, you would have to restart the SQL Server service. Note that it is actually telling us what we need to do in order to restart the SQL Server service. I'm going to restart the SQL Server service. Of course, I will get disconnected from my SQL Server Management Studio. And once I'm done, I can validate whether or not the change has taken effect. Of course, the only way to do that is to create a new database and see whether the database files, the MDF and the LDF files, are stored in that new location. Notice that now my data and log file directories now point to the one that I just created under TMP slash data folder. Let's try creating a new database. And because we're simply creating a database without providing the path to the data and the log files, we would assume that it will get created in the default data and log file directory, the one that we just created. Notice that inside the data directory or the slash TMP slash data directory are the data and the log files of the database that I just created. This shows you how you could use PuTTY to create the files rather than folders, to use ms-SQL Conf to configure SQL Server to make modifications to the SQL Server configuration, using PuTTY for executing commands using the command line, using WinSCP to navigate through the file system if you want to use a graphical user interface, and the also familiar SQL Server Management Studio for managing SQL Server. You've seen some of the basic tasks that you could perform using tools like PuTTY, WinSCP, and the all too familiar SQL Server Management Studio. Notice that the SQL Server experience is practically the same, provided that you're still using SQL Server Management Studio. This provides us with an opportunity to at least prove those Linux guys wrong that we could, as SQL Server DBAs, work with Linux managing our SQL Server databases. You've simply seen the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things that you could still do to perform. This should at least get you started. If you have additional questions regarding this presentation, feel free to reach out. Again, send your questions through email. Connect with me on social media through Twitter or LinkedIn. And thank you very much for watching.